I'm going to read you two extracts from the book. Could I have a quick show of hands of who in the room was kind enough to read my earlier novel, Notes from an Exhibition? Oh, lovely. Thank you, Richard and Judy. That's very kind. This novel isn't a sequel to Notes from an Exhibition, but it was conceived as a companion novel, a sort of echo chamber to it. Notes from an Exhibition is very much a book about motherhood and creativity. And I thought it was only fair to put the boot into fatherhood as well. And this book is very much about fatherhood, but also about faith, not least because at the centre of the book is a parish priest in a very remote parish in the far west of Cornwall, the parish next door to where I live, in fact, though I hasten to add this priest is completely made up. The book's original title wasn't A Perfectly Good Man, it was called Good People, right up until when I delivered it, and then in their wisdom my publishers suddenly noticed they were already publishing a crime novel called Good People the same month, so I had to change the title. But that gives you an idea that my original conception was very much a book about a group of people who are all apparently good. So I'm going to read to you about one of the very good ones, and also one of the very bad ones who only appears to be good. I write my novels in a very odd way, in that I don't write them in the way they appear in the book. I write them one viewpoint at a time. So what I effectively do in my first draft is to write a series of little novellas, one from each viewpoint within the book, and then I weave them together in the second draft. And this character, Dorothy, was very much my way into the novel. She was the first micro-novel I wrote. And that's because I trusted her instinctively. She's a thoroughly good egg. She is a farmer's daughter, very, very practical, not particularly religious. And when we first meet her in this chapter, she's just lost her father. So the farm is in a bit of a crisis without a breadwinner. So her other formidable mother has decided they need to have a lodger. So they take in a lodger in the shape of the new curate of the parish, who is Barnaby Johnson, who, yes, turns out to be the hero of the novel. Now, Dorothy goes for several walks with Barnaby around the farm and gets rather keen on him, and they have a kiss. Very soon after which, Barnaby disappears without warning, and poor Dorothy is left all alone, it seems. She spent the rest of the day in a numb frenzy of usefulness, but the trouble with practical tasks was that they had a way of occupying the hands alone, leaving the mind free to wander and wonder. As she stripped his bed and washed his bedding for the last time, as she swept and tidied his room and closed it back into the tomb-like state in which it lay ready for visitors who never came, she thought over their last conversations, looking for ways in which she might have been to blame. Was she too bold? Was her family insufficiently old? She paid a visit to the forlorn little back bathroom he had been using. Having cleaned its worn, hip-pinching bath and rust-mottled sink, and retrieved his towel for the wash, she snatched up in a shamefaced impulse the nice soap which she had left in there for him instead of the Wright's coal tar her mother was convinced kept disease from the house. Soap lasted a long time with them because their water was so soft, but still there was something poignant in his not having even stayed long enough to progress to a second bar of it. It was only as she called in on her room to return the soap to her own sink that she found the envelope he had slipped under her door. The vigour with which he had flicked it through had sent it almost entirely beneath her bedside rug, where it might have lain hidden for weeks. She snatched it up. It was addressed to Dorothy, Pink Bedroom. Inside was a black and white postcard of the Mermaid Chair in Zena Church, on the back of which he had simply written, "Write to me," and his new grim-sounding address in Portsmouth. All she knew of Portsmouth came from Mansfield Park. Austen's evocation of the crowded, genteel poverty of Fanny Price's home was fairly off-putting, and she suspected time and 2 world wars had made the port less appealing still. She dropped his towel where she stood, hurried to the ugly Victorian sewing table that had always served as her desk, and wrote to him at once. She wrote 4 sides of Basildon Bond, What, in effect, was her first ever love letter, although its tone was almost as guarded as their earliest conversations had been. Because saying things and committing them to paper where others might read them was so different. Then she dumped the towel in the twin tub and hurried up to the village letterbox. She liked the thought that the letter would soon be travelling up country on the same train line that was already carrying him. By the time her mother drove back from a trip into town with a friend, carrying a box of groceries from the co-op, Dorothy was almost cheerful. His answer came within the week. He had made a mistake, he wrote, left on impulse, and now was in a kind of hell, missing her, the landscape, their walks. Her letter, he said, was precious, and she must write more, even if he was sometimes kept too busy to write back. So of course she replied. She had always suspected her letters were like herself, calm and possibly not very interesting. She wrote accounts of her tasks, of news from the village, of developments at the mine, or at the Sunday school where she had started to help out, inspired by him, and didn't feel she could drop out of now that he had gone. She began to keep notes in an old exercise book in her room of things to remember to tell him, things she had seen or that people had said, but she was careful not to write too often. She wrote every other Friday, the day he had gone, and she continued to limit herself to 2 pieces of Basildon bond. He wrote back to her only that once. For a while she didn't mind. She convinced herself he would write if he could, and she enjoyed writing the letters anyway. It was the most creative and thoughtful she had allowed herself to be since leaving school. But after 3 long months of unanswered letters, she dared entertain the suspicion that his first reply had been no more than sensitive politeness, humouring her, and that proved a poison to her hopes, and she let their non-correspondence cease. Well, time passes. And then Barnaby Johnson appeared in the yard without warning. It was late afternoon. It had been unseasonably warm, oppressive, milk-turning weather that had brought clouds of thunderflies into the sheds. Dorothy was in the act of bringing in laundry from the line in the Maui and saw him from behind a sheet without his seeing her. He walked up to the front door, shadowed by the dog, and then hesitated, visibly nervous, and went to check the milking parlour instead, before heading back to the front door. She watched from her hiding place. He wore extraordinarily shiny black shoes and seemed taller and more grown up somehow. He seemed to have invested in a new, darker suit, a very well-cut one. It looked expensive. She slipped off to one side and in through the scullery. Her mother was in the kitchen, furiously rolling out pastry, and she reached her just before the door knocker sounded through the house. Dorothy had never been so decisive. "It's him," she told her. "He's come back. I'm not here." Flustered, her mother was taking off her apron and brushing flour from her hands. But what should I..." she began. "I don't know. I'm not here, that's all. I'm in Truro for the day." She had expected a protest on moral grounds. Her mother was rigorously truthful, so was surprised that she hurried out directly as he knocked again, and half closed the kitchen door behind her. Dorothy positioned herself to one side of it so that she could hear, but could also escape silently through the scullery if need arose. She heard every word of the conversation that followed. "Mrs. Sampson?" "Hello, Dorothy's not here." Her mother's voice was harsh with anxiety. Dorothy knew what the lie cost her, but perhaps she convinced herself "not here" could simply mean "not in the hall right now." "Good," he said. "That's good, because it's not her I came to see, not really." "Oh, well, will you come in? Can I fetch you a drink? Tea or something cold? It's warm out there." "No, thank you, I can't stay." "Well, let me just..." And her mother must have stepped out to join him in the sunny yard, because her words became maddeningly indistinct. Then Dorothy heard the front door shut, and the sounds from outside, birdsong, cattle lowing, were abruptly muffled. She hurried out into the scullery and watched through the window, amid the sharp scents of cheese rind, quinces, and cold lamb from the day before yesterday, as her mother walked with him to the top of the yard and back onto the lane. The two of them were talking with some animation. Then something he said made her stop, shake her mother's hand, and unhesitatingly plant a kiss on her mother's cheek before he walked away. Her mother stood there a moment, gazing after him, and one hand rose to touch her face. Then she turned and looked with unerring instinct towards the scullery window, and her expression was as stricken as Dorothy could remember seeing it, worse than when Dad died, and there were tears on her wrinkled cheeks. She'd not cried when Dad died, or not in the open, not like this. And Dorothy ran out and took her in her arms. They were not people who touched. She had not realized her mother had become so very thin, and she worried once again she might be ill with stomach ulcers or worse, and not telling her. Her mother did not embrace her back, but said only, "I'm sorry," pulling back and controlling herself with a kind of shudder. "I meant it for the best. I was thinking of you. I didn't want you hurt." "I don't understand," Dorothy told her. Some people were approaching on the footpath. She set a hand in the small of her mother's back and gently steered her towards the open front door and privacy. "As a priest wife, you'd always be poor." Dorothy smiled. "I never thought to marry money, Mum. Anyway, who says he's interested? And it's a hard life," her mother went on quietly, ignoring her. "Harder than marrying a farmer." "Oh, on a farm there's always work. The work never ends, and there's often uncertainty, but you stand together. And he may be exhausted half the time and out of the house the rest, but you have him to yourself, girl. The husband who's a priest will never be yours entirely. You have to share him, your house, your family too. He'll always have a higher duty than to you." She could tell this was a speech her mother had rehearsed in her head, maybe even muttered aloud as she milked the cows. "I know all this," she told her. "Do you think I haven't worked this out for myself weeks ago? It's all by the by now. What did he want, anyway? You still haven't said. Mother? I don't think I've ever seen a vicar's wife who was happy, not outside of a novel." Her mother broke off and looked into Dorothy's face with something like wonder, as though seeing it somehow transformed. "I meant it for the best," she said again. "I was only thinking of your happiness." "For pity's sake, stop talking in code," Dorothy told her. "What have you gone and done?" Her mother shrank in on herself again, accepting defeat. "They're all here," she said, and led the way back along the hall to the tall mahogany bookcase which stood at one end, beside the looking-glass where she would always give a quick, corrective glare at herself before leaving the house, and the table where the only telephone was, chairless and far from the nearest heat source, so that calls were kept short. She reached for the top shelf and took down a volume of the rarely consulted old encyclopedia that was ranged there. "They weren't so hard to find," she said wryly. "I put them under P for priest." She took out a small bundle of envelopes and handed them over, then returned to the kitchen and her pie-making. There were 8 letters in all. Only the first had been opened. Presumably discretion had overruled curiosity once her mother had learnt to recognise his handwriting and the Portsmouth postmark. Dorothy sat on the stairs to read them. Blood sang in her ears and burned in her cheeks. She could hear the familiar rhythmic thump of her mother's rolling pin. Well, sure enough, Dorothy does get her man, but he proves a rather mixed blessing. When I was researching this book, I made a point not only of talking to lots of priests, but also to their wives and their children. And I had a particularly memorable conversation with an archbishop's wife, who will remain nameless, who said, "Oh, well, Jesus is all very well, but he didn't have a wife and children, did he?" So I was particularly keen to show just how hard it is being married to a priest, especially in a remote country parish where you are so vulnerable to all comers and your house is sort of open to everyone. Now, by way of contrast, as I promised, I want to read about one of the nasty characters in the book. Really the only nasty character. As I said, I write my books in this very odd way where I just do one character at a time. And it was particularly stressful doing this character because I had to stay with him for week after week after week. And he was a really horrible person to have to keep company with. And I had to get under his skin. And he is immensely fat, physically repellent, and morally utterly repugnant. And it was a bit like putting on a second-hand sweaty fat suit day after day. His name is Modest Carlson. And when we first meet him, he has just done time in prison for raping a schoolgirl who was in his charge. On leaving prison, Winchester Jail, he catches on impulse a train to Portsmouth and there takes on a very run-down second-hand bookshop and discovers that he can make quite a lot of money, not so much from selling books as from trading in vintage pornography. And when this little extract begins, he has been very badly beaten up by some drunken sailors, and his life is saved, really, by a priest. And he can't see the priest's face because his eyes are full of blood, but he has quite a conversation with him, so he knows what he sounds like. And the priest gives him a handkerchief with which to mop the blood while he waits for the ambulance. And when he comes to, he discovers that the handkerchief has the monogram B on it. You've guessed it, it's Barnaby. And he then impulsively spends the following Sundays trying to track the priest down, going to church after church after church, and getting rather drawn into the religion while he's at it. Anyway, in this extract, he has finally tracked down his quarry. The priest was by some way the youngest person in the room, so even had he not been good-looking, his presence would have carried a certain charge. Modest was immune to male beauty. What he found compelling was vulnerability. From the moment he began to give out suitably threadbare parish notices, young Mr. Johnson was laying himself wide open to mockery. The other priests Modest had been studying on Sundays past were absurd sometimes, often even, with their robes and posturing and portentousness. Most drew a defensive haughtiness about them, as though judging before they be judged. This man, by contrast, gave the impression of having no such defensive lair, but radiated an innocent certainty. His was the unquestioning belief of a child, like belief in Father Christmas, or fairies, or a mother's beauty, or a father's love. This was belief that compelled one to fall in with it and follow, because to do otherwise would be a kind of cruelty. As the service began in earnest with a hymn, and the priest processed in, fully robed, with one elderly acolyte carrying a cross before him and another bringing up the rear, Modest glanced around and saw that the people there loved their vicar. Man and woman alike stole shy glances at Mr. Johnson as he passed them and stared boldly at him when he was before them. With his robes, he had not assumed pomposity like the prison chaplain or the priest in the hideous council estate church Modest had attended the previous week. He merely assumed an utterly sincere solemnity. He was, Modest decided, like a considerate child who had begun performing a magic trick only to discover that the magic was real and possibly dangerous. One could imagine him, resolute yet terrified, conducting an exorcism. His voice, unquestionably the same he had heard from the gutter that terrible night, filled him with an unsettling desire to confess all and be absolved. As they were all filing out and handing back their prayer books and hymnals, the flower arranger greeted him again. "That was a very good service," he told her. "We're lucky to have him," she said. "I'm sorry, what was your vicar's first name again?" he asked, although she hadn't said. "Barnaby," she said. "Barnaby Johnson. I hope we'll see you again." As at the altar rail, he managed to be the last in line at the door. Before he shook Johnson's hand, he handed him back the handkerchief. It was immediately evident that Johnson remembered the incident, but not the face that went with it. "How are you?" he asked, concerned. "I should have recognized you straight away." "Perhaps with a bloody nose I'd have looked more familiar," Modest said, and they shared a laugh. "Let me introduce you," the priest said. "This is Patience, who's attended this church all her life, so can always tell me who people are or where things belong." "How do you do?" said an elegant old woman in a purple summer coat. "What's your name?" "Modest," he told her. "Modest Carlson." "Of course it is," Mr. Johnson said. "I remember now. You had a Swedish father and a Russian mother." "Full marks," Modest said, and they laughed again. "Well, I hope you come back," Mr. Johnson added, "now that you know where we are. Patience will show you the ropes. She knows everything about everybody." The old woman clucked to herself and batted a hand at him. so it was plain she was deeply in love as the rest of them. Mr. Johnson had slipped away, clearly adept at parishioner evasion. The old woman had fixed on Barnaby a gaze of comfortless inquiry. "Would you care for a sherry?" she asked. Modest noticed her magnificent amethyst brooch and accepted. Patience, Miss Boyle, lived in a house that would easily have accommodated a family of 6. She lived alone, curator to what was, in effect, a museum to her parents. Born to expect more out of life than Portsmouth, her mother had married a dashing naval officer and somehow become stranded there on his death. She had left their sole child not only the guardian of a house full of treasures and memories, but the sole repository of a lifetime of prejudice and suspicion. Bitter in outlook and acid of tongue, Patience Boyle had not been granted even the compensation of a husband and children, and now had no friends. "We have a friend in Jesus," she told Modest with startlingly naked cynicism. She appeared to accept him entirely at face value. It also seemed that for all his carefulness, she recognized in him a kindred spirit, another lost soul. He grew pleasantly dizzy on her excellent wine society sherry, while she regaled him with unflattering portraits of every member of the congregation. All were found to be hypocrites in some way or other, neither as sweet nor as pious as they appeared. "It's a good thing you found me first," she said. "Saved you so much time and effort." Only young Mr. Johnson was spared her judgment. "Anyone can see he's the real thing. Far too good for us to hold on to him for long. Not like Mr. Xavier." She made a face. "Who was he?" he prompted. "Oh, another priest. Ghastly little man, quite ghastly. You'll meet him before too long. Breath that would bring down a bustard." She made him share a tin of the better quality chicken soup, to which she added yet more sherry and a carton of cream, then sent him on his way with the odd sensation that although she had asked him not one question, he had just made a friend. It was no road to Damascus moment. He did not change perceptibly. He continued to run the shop, making his best money from selling pornography snatched from the shamefaced and first editions tricked from the innocent. He continued to drink heavily and to lead a life of barely concealed squalor. All that had altered was that he now attended church and, with a minimum of effort, it seemed to him, sustained a friendship. He attended on Sundays, sitting within glancing distance of Patience, but not with her, and he soon began also to attend occasional morning or evening services, the stripped-down ones without time-consuming music, at which he was frequently the only person present besides the young priest. If Mr. Johnson was surprised to see him, he didn't show it, which gave Modest a powerful sense of these morning and evening offices being observed for their own sake, inexorable as the motions of sun and moon, regardless of who watched them. It was as though, assisted by the priest, the dour, undistinguished building were praying to itself. He took the opportunities these services afforded to watch Barnaby Johnson openly, to notice his very clean nails and clumsily cut hair, the way there was often a catch in his voice when he said the grace. There was nearly always a small red book about him, either in his hands or on his prayer stool, or, when he was in his civilian clothes, jutting out of his jacket pocket. Modest itched to ask him what it was, or even to pick it up and hold it for himself. It was not a Bible or a Psalter, and he had never seen him read from it, yet it was plainly important to him. Sometimes Johnson spoke with him briefly afterwards. More often he hurried off about his work. "I'm glad Patience has found you," he confided one morning. "You're doing her good." This made Modest realize she was a parish burden, prickly, difficult, a source of guilt to the kinder souls who failed to love her. And that in turn led him to see how effortlessly he might become such a burden too, unloved, unlovable, yet ineluctably among them like a moist, secretive toad. And how all around might continue to be repelled and to turn aside, yet God and this young man, his vulnerable avatar, were compelled repeatedly to forgive and welcome him. Thank you. Well...